By the end of the 18th century, whaling was a leading commercial activity around the globe. Whaling was especially lucrative for regions positioned along the Atlantic Ocean. Thus, given its good harbor, Nantucket emerged as a capital of this developing and profitable industry. Even before the Revolutionary War, whaling was not new. By 1760, the Nantucketers had practically wiped out the local whale population. In 1819, 14-year-old Thomas Nickerson joined the whale ship Essex as a cabin boy. It was the most pleasing moment of my life. He'd been taught to idolize the form of his ship. On any Nantucket whaling expedition, there was a hierarchy based upon experience, race, and birth origin. But even within this close-knit familial community, there were distinctions, and Thomas Nickerson was on the outside looking in. They called mainlanders strangers, or, even worse, koofs, a term of disparagement that included all of those unlucky enough to have been born on the mainland. Despite their prejudices, ship owners relied on off-islanders with no previous sailing experience, known as green hands, to man their vessels. While the men were off at sea, Nantucket developed relatively progressive gender roles for its time. Quakerism contributed to women's strength, who on Nantucket tended to be better educated than the island's men, were just as intelligent, just as capable as their male counterparts. Upon leaving the strong women to tackle the issues, the men faced the danger at sea. The Essex had been rolled almost 90 degrees onto her side. Luckily, they survived being knocked down and continued sailing. From Nantucket, the Essex sailed across the Atlantic to the Azores, south to Cape Verde, and down around Cape Horn. After cruising up the South American coast, they headed out into the Pacific. After an arduous voyage, the lookout finally saw a whale. It required sharp eyes to spot a whale's spout. All it took for the lookout to bellow, "There she blows!" After launching the whaleboats, the crew rowed in pursuit, but Chase's boat was in peril. A second whale had come up from beneath them, giving their boat a tremendous whack with its tail and pitching them into the sky. After an unsuccessful first day, the crew kept hunting. Several days after Chase's boat was repaired, the lookout once again sighted whales. A harpoon was hurled, launching the boat and crew on the voyage's first Nantucket sleigh ride. After towing the whale back to the ship, the crew began the butchering process. First, the mates hacked a hole into the whale's side, just above the fin, into which was inserted a giant hook suspended from the mast. Pulled by the tackle attached to the windlass, the blubber strip was gradually torn from the whale's carcass, lowered below decks to be cut into more manageable pieces. After processing the whale, the crew felt ravenously hungry. As a result, the crew approached their captain about the inequality of portions on board the Essex. One of the men, the tub of the beef on his shoulder, made his way aft. Pollard glanced at the tub of beef, and Nickerson watched as his complexion seemed to shift from red to blue to almost black. Even with the captain not giving in to their plea, the voyage continued. During a sudden squall around Cape Horn, the ship was slammed by harsh winds, but they shortened sail and sailed through. From the southwest, a line of ink-black clouds was hurtling in their direction. In an instant, the squall slammed into the ship with the force of a cannon shot. The crew, still disturbed from the storm a few days prior, landed at Charles Island to look for food. It was on Charles Island that they procured a 600-pound monster of a tortoise. It took 6 men to carry it to the beach on crossed poles. While the others hunted tortoises, one of the crew used a tinderbox to set fire to the island. It was the height of the dry season, and the fire soon burned out of control. By the time they had returned to the ship, the entire island was ablaze. Back at sea, the ship was rammed by an enormous sperm whale. The whale rammed the ship just forward of the forechains. The Essex shook as if she had struck a rock. Every man was knocked off his feet. Following the sperm whale's brutal attack, the Essex took on water and William Bond salvaged some navigational instruments. The ship was sinking bow first, men's sea chests and mattresses floating on the rising tide. As the ship was sinking, crew members cut away the masts and began a salvage operation. Their first priority was to get as much food and water out of the wreck as possible. To do that, they needed to cut away the masts so that the still partially floating hull could right. After salvaging everything they could, the crew transformed the whaleboats into rudimentary sailing vessels. The men worked, equipping each boat with 2 short masts, 2 sprit sails, and a small sail up forward known as a jib. Despite some debate, Captain Pollard agreed to try to sail back to South America. If they sailed south for about 1,500 miles to latitude 26 south, they would enter a band of variable breezes which they could then ride to Chile or Peru. Once the sailboats had been rigged, crew were assigned to each whaleboat, with the captain's boat being almost all Nantucketers. This inequitable separation of sailors disadvantaged Matthew Joy's boat from the beginning. The Nantucketers' clannishness strongly influenced the makeup of the 3 crews. So did rank. As captain, Pollard was given the most Nantucketers. Chase managed to get 2. Matthew Joy found himself without a single Nantucketer. Instead, he was given 4 of the 6 blacks. On board the makeshift sailboats, the sailors survived on meager rations of hardtack and water. The daily ration was equivalent to 6 slices of bread, less than a third of the nourishment required by an ordinary man. Often customary in times of distress, sailors leaned upon the strong religious faith of their African American shipmates. That evening, Richard Peterson, the sole African American on their boat, led them in prayers and a few hymns. After weeks of sailing and no signs of rescue, both morale and rations diminished. Even though their supply of water was in even greater danger of running out, Chase had no alternative but to maintain their daily ration at a half pint. On the 24th day at sea, the men discovered a second leak below the waterline of Chase's boat. Lawrence was in the water, pressing the hatchet up against the bottom of the boat. Just as he had predicted, the sprung plank was drawn in snug. Later, they landed on Henderson Island. While there, Captain Pollard and his steward, William Bond, surprised the crew with a magnificent repast. After collecting more fish and birds, they sat down for the evening meal. With a dependable source of water and a seemingly bountiful supply of food, they now thought it possible to hold out indefinitely on the island. Nevertheless, in just 5 days, these 20 voracious men had exhausted their portion of the island. As the crew made preparations to press on, 3 men announced that they would stay on the island. With downcast eyes and trembling lips, the 3 men drew away from the rest of the crew. They transformed the tree into a Galapagos-like post office, placing letters in a small wooden box they nailed to a trunk. Many days at sea later, Matthew Joy's condition worsened. After initially moving to Pollard's boat, he asked to return to his own boat to say his final goodbyes. His loyalty to his crew was in the end greater than his need for comfort from his fellow Nantucketers. The transfer was made, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, Matthew Joy was dead. After the death of Matthew Joy, Chase's boat was separated. As soon as the daylight appeared, they stood up on the seats, craning their necks for a glimpse of their lost companions, but they had disappeared. Meanwhile, on Joy's boat, the crew revealed they had exhausted their rations. Pollard and his men shared with them what little bread they had, knowing full well that at only a few more days there would be nothing left. Due to this shortage, Pollard's and Hendrick's boats began to consider the prospect of cannibalism. Hendricks and his crew dared speak of a subject that had been on all of their minds, whether they should eat instead of bury the body. They were about to eat one of their own shipmates. Another problem they faced was the potential of getting split up, leaving Hendrick's boat without any form of navigation. Pollard and his men looked up to find the whaleboat containing Obed Hendricks, William Bond, and Joseph West had disappeared. Alone at sea and desperately hungry, Pollard agreed to cast lots. They cut up a scrap of paper and placed the pieces in a hat. The lot fell to Owen Coffin. Owen Coffin laid his head down on the boat's gunwale. He was soon dispatched, Pollard would later recall, and nothing of him left. Lots were drawn again to see who would shoot the boy. It fell to Coffin's friend, Charles Ramsdell. After Coffin's death, Isaac Cole died in misery after ranting incoherently for a number of hours. The three men left his body alone. Twitching spasmodically, he sat up and called for a napkin and a water, then fell down to the bottom of the boat as if struck dead, only to pop up again like a possessed jack-in-the-box. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Isaac Cole was dead. Later, Chase attempted to bring everyone to their senses. However, given a stark choice of eating coal or casting lots, they decided the following. Better to eat a dead shipmate, even a tainted shipmate, than be forced to kill a man. After several more days at sea, Nickerson expressed his desire to end his sufferings. Luckily, Lawrence spotted a sail in the distance, and after some hard sailing, they were saved. Similar to the other lost whaleboat, Pollard and Ramsdell were rescued by the Dauphin. On the morning of February 23rd, the Dauphin's crew saw two men in a whaleboat filled with bones. The captain ordered his men to lower a boat and bring the two survivors aboard. With two boats rescued and one still missing, a boat was sent to rescue the men on Henderson Island. Finally, Chappell dove into the sea. He reached the launch and was pulled aboard. With a rope tied around his waist, he dove into the water and swam back over the coral to the beach. One at a time, the three of them were pulled out to the boat. Although some were rescued, the others were still missing. Months later, long after Captain Rain had searched the Ducie Island, another ship touched down there. The crew discovered a whaleboat washed up on the brittle shore with 4 skeletons inside. While the 4 men in Joy's boat never returned, the others returned home. On June 11th, the Eagle arrived at the Nantucket bar, but standing alongside Ramsdell was not George Pollard. Instead, there were 3 ghosts: Owen Chase, Benjamin Lawrence, and Thomas Nickerson. 2 months later, Captain Pollard returned to Nantucket, but his own aunt could not bear his presence. Nancy Coffin did not take to her son's death well. The idea that the man to whom she had entrusted the care of her 17-year-old son was living as a consequence of her boy's death was too much for her to bear. Just months after returning, Pollard embarked upon a new whaling journey. Unfortunately, the ship ran into a coral reef, destroying the boat and forcing the crew to escape on whaleboats. Thomas Nickerson noticed Pollard standing on the ship's railings, staring down worriedly into the sea. The ship had struck something with a fearful crash, and he was thrown to the floor. As Pollard's whaling career came to a close, the whaling industry and the town of Nantucket were also falling on hard times. For Nantucket, the difficult times grew dreadful, as in July of 1846, Nantucket erupted into flames. The next morning, more than a third of the town, and almost all of the commercial district, was a charred wasteland. Even after the fire and Nantucketers' endeavor to rebuild the town mostly in stone this time, the industry of whaling was no longer the financial gold mine it once was. Nantucket, once the whaling capital of the world, was all but a ghost town by the time the last survivors of the Essex disaster began to pass away. Of the fates of those that survived the Essex, Owen Chase might have faced the harshest. In his old age, Chase fell into madness and despair. Eventually, he would pass away in 1869. Old age was not kind to Owen Chase. His memory of his sufferings in an open boat never left him, and late in life, he began hiding food in the attic of his house on Orange Street. By 1868, Chase was judged insane. The fateful voyage of the whale ship Essex reveals much about the perils of sailing in a 3-masted schooner, the savage rapacity of the whaling industry, the inequality and provincial prejudices of the 19th century America, and the bravery, ingenuity, and intensely human desire for survival.